George Smith Patton Jr. grew up in a wealthy family in San Marino, California. In fact, anybody that's visited the Huntington Library is just right next to where Patton grew up as a child. It was a military family, but his mother had inherited property, and they had property. He didn't need to go in the military, but he grew up with a father and grandfather both served Civil War and in earlier wars in America, and that's what he wanted to be from the time he was a shaver. So at age 18, he joined the military, and he served in the military all of his life until he turned 60 when he was involved with an accident that ultimately took his life. 42 years. At any rate, this is a photograph signed by Patton. It's hard to see the signature because he signed across his waist here, and it's in the dark part. So it may not be able to show up. But it's signed by Patton during his achievement in World War II when he finally came out of the doghouse for slapping the two soldiers in North Africa and was not a decoy anymore for D-Day, and given gas by Ike and told, go get the Rhine, and he did. He led the charge into Germany. He would have gone to Moscow if I could have given him some extra gas. He says, we got to fight the blanks sometime, so we might as well do it now. So he was well ahead of his time. It was well known that the Russians and their generals and Patton did not get along. He was left in charge after the war of denazification. He always wanted to die in wartime. He didn't want to be spared warrior's death and glory. He was always harping back that he'd come from Greek battles or Roman battles or something like this. He had the military in his veins, probably one of our greatest wartime generals of all time. Certainly one of the gutsiest. At any rate, he was called Old Blood and Guts, and the soldiers that served under him, including my father-in-law, always said, well, it was his guts and our blood. He was a great leader. His men actually loved him, and he always said, if they ever quit being scared of me, then we've lost the war. So he ruled a very close and tight hand. A lot of people don't realize that in his younger years, he headed our first tank corps chasing Pancho Villa in the deserts under Pershing before we entered World War I in 1916, chasing the Mexicans that had invaded the United States for the first time since the War of 1812. He wrote some fascinating letters during that period, and then he followed Pershing as tank commander in World War I, and he became our real tank leader as we got up into the Second World War period, and led the armor really in World War II across Europe. In the 1912 Olympics, the military always got one spot where they could put somebody in the Olympics back then, and Patton was our representative from the military in the 1912 Olympics, which the pentathlon was won by Jim Thorpe, the great American Indian, but Patton came in 5th, which ain't bad if you think about it, and was a real tough fighter. He was a tall man. He wore pearl-handled pistols in his later career. Was quite famous for a lot of his little attributes, but mostly his toughness. He turned his tanks in the midst of winter to go save Anthony McAuliffe, who the famous general said nuts to the German commander when he was told to surrender or he'd be annihilated. And Patton said, any of our generals that's that eloquent needs to be saved. And so he turned his tanks to Bastogne and saved them during the Battle of the Bulge. When he died, it was kind of not a hero's death in a way. It wasn't the kind of thing that Patton would have wanted. But right after the war, he gets in a traffic accident. He's in his command car with his driver driving, and they get run into by a truck operated by a bunch of drunk GIs that are out celebrating. And they were really 3 sheets of the wind, I guess, the driver. And the only one injured, the driver escaped okay, but Patton had his neck broken. And a lot of people don't realize that Patton had broken his neck earlier in his life when he was a young man, and miraculously survived that. And he knew he was a goner at this time. He actually lived for 10 days after the accident, in horrible pain, but he never showed it to anybody. He was a tough hombre. And it was enough time to fly his wife Bea from California over, and she was by his bedside as he was there in the hospital in Germany. And it was during that time that medical records were kept on him that were lost during the great GSA fire in 1973. Most of the military records from World War II, and Vietnam and Korea. Many of them were lost in a huge fire at GSA in St. Louis, including all of Patton's medical records. Been several books and TV shows about how Patton really died, and how because of the hatred of Joe Stalin for what Patton had said, let's go take Moscow now, that Joe Stalin had somehow sent a crew in to poison him. Yes, he'd been in a car accident, but it had been faked because there were no military records, and he had really died of poisoning after the accident in the hospital because Stalin was so fearful of him, influence on Eisenhower and others. A medical record on Patton shows up at auction, his toe tag, and it came up, and I couldn't believe it. It was up for auction. It's a complete medical record, really, as you read it. What happened was that when it wasn't needed, after Patton's death, it was taken off his bed, or toe, as they call it, and it was torn in four. You can see how the nurse who pulled it out of the garbage taped it up and took it away and put it in her scrapbook as a souvenir of having helped with Patton during the time of his death. Her son found it in her scrapbook, puts it up for auction a couple years ago, and guess who gets it? I happened to win it at auction. I fought off a few people, but I got it, and I was thrilled to get it. And it's the only existing medical record of Patton that's original. It's Patton George S. Jr. typed out on one side, General U.S. Army, 60, California, 42 years in the service, and so on. It says, typed out myelitis, traumatic, acute, traverse, fourth cervical segment, incomplete severage of the fracture of his neck, and it's signed by Colonel Bell in Germany. On the other side, though, is more interesting. On the other side is typed out the doctor that took care of him, the young captain, actually types out a medical record on Patton that kind of takes the part in a shorthand version of what must have been in the longhand records that were lost. Supplemental record. Vertebrae with posterior dislocation of third cervical vertebrae on fourth wounds, laceration of nose, forehead, and scalp. Accidentally incurred in an auto accident, 11:15 hours, 9 December 1945, near Mannheim, Germany. And then he records what happened thereafter. On the 20th of December, hours at 2:20 hours in the morning, pulmonary infarction. He had a heart attack. Right upper lobe, edema, pulmonary acute. On the next day, 21st December 45, myocardial failure acute, and he died. But then the doctor decided to write longhand a little more specific, okay? So beyond the type thing, the doctor, the young captain, writes, he says, December 19th, death rattles, gave the general atropine and oxygen. And then the 21st, the day he died, he said, resting quietly, but told the nurse several times that he was going to die, and he died at 17:55, that'd be 5:55 in the afternoon, with sudden stop of heart, myocardial failure, spinal cord damaged, third cervical, repeats it again, broken neck. One of the criticisms has been that there was no autopsy done. And so that was part of the theory. Well, if there'd been an autopsy done, they could have proven how he died. And it says, no autopsy, permission refused by Mrs. Patton on the death certificate. So that answers that question, too. And then it's signed by the young Dr. Kent and buried at Ham, Luxembourg, December 24th, New Year's Eve of 45. Now, Mrs. Patton B. wanted him buried at West Point. Thought he deserved that. Ike vetoed that. He said, look, our men over here, this is still part of the war at this point, our men over here are buried where they fall. Your husband needs to be buried here in Europe. And so she said, well, let's bury him up by where the Battle of the Bulge took place. Let's bury him up by Luxembourg. So that's where he's buried.